Hi there, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the sixth in a series of mini-lectures on Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. Today we're going to talk about character, style, and the meanings of distance. One of the most subtle and interesting changes that Elizabeth undergoes after reading Darcy's letter is a change in her own style. You remember me saying last week that in Volume 1 she sounds a lot like her father? Well, by the end of Volume 2, she's beginning to sound rather different. In Chapter 18, you remember she tries to persuade her father not to allow Lydia to go to Brighton with Captain and Mrs. Forster. She's making this argument because by now she has begun to see her family through Darcy's eyes. In his letter, he had written, "The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety, so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your three youngest sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you." Now, compare the way Elizabeth addresses her father 20 pages later. He laughs in response to her warnings and asks her how many of her admirers have been driven off by her sister's bad behavior. That has to sting more than he knows at this point. She replies haughtily, "It is not of peculiar, but of general evils which I am now complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurance and disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly." She sounds just like Darcy, not only in the content of what she's saying, which repeats his criticism of her sisters and of her father too, but also in the way she says it, right down to the echo of his, "Pardon me, it pains me to offend you," in her, "Excuse me, for I must speak plainly." If you recall at this point that character means not only moral qualities and attributes, but also the style of writing and speaking peculiar to an individual, then you'll see that it's not only Lydia's character which is at stake in this passage, but also Lizzie's, for she has changed her peculiar style, and is no longer imitating her father, either in his arch manner of speaking or in his indulgent mockery of her sister's behavior. She has adopted the character of Darcy in both senses. If you're reading this novel for the first time, I wonder whether you were at all surprised that Wickham turns out to be a cad, Mr. Wicked, and Darcy a decent fellow. Somehow, I managed to get through my childhood and adolescence without ever reading Pride and Prejudice, which I encountered for the first time as a graduate student in English Lit. I still remember the intense pleasure with which I read the book for the first time. I also remember the complete naivete with which I read it, resenting Darcy, liking Wickham, and then feeling duped when their true characters were revealed. Now, you may be too perceptive to have been taken in, but if any of you did have that experience, then you'll know, as I did, how Elizabeth feels when she discovers the truth. As readers of the novel, we're reading characters just as she is, for the word character also refers to a personality invested with distinctive attributes and qualities by a novelist or dramatist. In reading literary characters, we are interpreting their attributes and qualities, judging character in a moral sense. It's interesting to go back and reread earlier scenes after discovering the truth. That's what we did last time in looking back briefly at the first conversation with Wickham. It's what Elizabeth does, too, when she remembers some of the hypocrisy in his behavior that had previously escaped her notice. This looking back and revising our first impressions is crucial to what I've called learning to read backwards. It does mean, partly, learning to see things differently in retrospect. But it also means learning to be a better reader of first impressions, a better judge of character. That's what it takes to get affective individualism right. Okay, I'd like to change gears now and talk to you a little bit about distance. Novels like Pride and Prejudice are often described as realistic because the characters and events in them are plausible. Darcy is not required to slay any dragons to win Elizabeth, And Wickham, though he charms her, is not an enchanter. The symbols in the novel are also unobtrusive. A fence, a letter, a picture, a song. These are the sorts of ordinary things that carry large meanings in Austen's novel. I'd like to focus on distance as a way of showing how symbolism in the novel works. If you'll look back to page 118, you'll find that Darcy has come to call on Elizabeth at the parsonage. This is before his first spurned proposal to her, but not very long before it. Trying in his usual strained way to make light conversation, he observes that Charlotte must like being settled so near her family and friends in Hertfordshire. Elizabeth expresses surprise. To her, 50 miles isn't close at all. You remember in Romeo and Juliet how much more freedom of movement Romeo enjoyed? 200 years later, Darcy enjoys the same privilege, but he isn't aware of the extent to which it is a privilege. Both his wealth and his sex make travel much easier for him than they are for young ladies of limited means. In this disagreement about geographical distance, we see another sort of distance opening up between Darcy and Elizabeth. It is the social, economic, and sexual difference that makes travel so much easier for him than for her. Darcy misunderstands the source of their disagreement, though. Her sense that 50 miles is a long way is proof, he suggests, of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighborhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far. He thinks it's a question of emotional attachment to the place where she grew up. Elizabeth corrects him, translating the question back into economic terms. Where there is fortune to make the expense of traveling unimportant, distance becomes no evil, she says. At this point, Darcy drew his chair a little towards her. He wants to be on more intimate terms, lessening the social and psychological distance between himself and Elizabeth. As he does so, he makes a loaded observation. You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment, he says. You cannot always have been at Longbourn. Well, why not? I think Darcy means several things at once, but they all have to do with the distance between Elizabeth and her family. He is struck by how different she is from the rest of them, and he's already thinking about marrying her. So one thing he means, obviously, is, hey, you wouldn't need to live that close to your awful mother and sisters, would you? You don't honestly want to be around them all the time, do you? But another thing he seems to mean is, you have a superior understanding. You obviously didn't acquire it at home. You must have traveled. Elizabeth, says the narrator, looked surprised. We aren't told what exactly surprises her, whether it's Darcy's physical approach as he moves his chair closer, or the peculiarity of his questions, which seem to drive a wedge between her and her family in a way she can't possibly understand. But the combination, as Darcy draws closer and tries to pry her away from her family, sets off an alarm. Darcy responds to her surprise by drawing back, both physically and emotionally. In its tiny way, this approach and rebuff anticipate the turning point to come when Darcy will insult Elizabeth's family while proposing marriage to her, and she will refuse him in anger. The tension of that moment and the complexity of the misunderstandings it contains are already suggested here, as Darcy tries to cross the physical distance between himself and Elizabeth, only to discover that they're separated by kinds and degrees of distance of which he has been entirely unconscious. This scene also anticipates Elizabeth's visit to Derbyshire in Volume 3. She travels into Darcy's world and finds the psychological and emotional distance between them shrinking when she does. Perhaps more indirectly, the scene also anticipates the final closing of distance between Darcy and Elizabeth as he replaces her father, becoming the voice inside her head. Because, as we all know,